This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Today's show begins with K-State Extension Rangeland Management Specialist Molly Reichenborn and K-State Range Scientist at Hays Keith Harmoney as they converse about managing rangeland and pastures after a wildfire. Molly and Keith also continue the show as they discuss more information about how cattle producers might manage their livestock if their forages were burnt. K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan ends today's show as he explains the type of vegetable crops that might need planted in the second or third week of March. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our show discussing rangeland and pasture management after wildfires. And then to talk about this, we're joined by K-State Extension Rangeland Management Specialist Molly Reichenborn and K-State Range Scientist at Hays Keith Harmoney. Molly, Keith, I appreciate both taking the time to join us today.
Howdy there.
Thanks, Shelby. Happy to be here.
So, Molly, as we're talking about management after wildfire, how does this really differ from a prescribed burn?
Really, the major difference between wildfire and prescribed fire is that one is planned and one is not. The temperatures can be a little bit hotter in wildfires, and what fuels actually catch on fire might vary between a prescribed fire and a wildfire. Say if we have a lot of brush or tree fuel load on the landscape during a prescribed fire, depending on the conditions, those may or may not actually catch fire in a prescribed fire versus a wildland fire, though it can happen. But the large difference between those two is that there can be a little higher temperature in wildfires, and one is planned and one is not.
Are there any concerns with there being a hotter temperature or higher temperature?
So in some cases in wildfire, and this is particularly relevant in the western part of the state where we have grasses that are bunch grasses, where their growing points are near the soil surface. It's possible in wildfires that they can receive some damage to those growing points that can relate to reduced forage production after a wildfire. But the important thing is to remember, even in western Kansas, where you might have, say, more bunch grasses like little blue stem or blue grama, that they are still part of a fire-adapted system. So we do expect them to recover. Even if they do take a bit of a hit, we do expect them to recover over time. And really, it's just important to keep that in mind when we're thinking about stocking rates after wildfires and making sure that we're considering that in the months and a couple of years after wildfire.
So I'll mention here, Molly talked about bunch grasses, blue grama and little blue stem. And in the 4-county fire that took place in 2021, little blue stem was one of the species that we saw decline the most in the aftermath of that fire when we tracked vegetation and the trends over time. And so those little blue stem plants that are bunch grasses, all new growth grows up from within the old growth in those bunch grasses, and that old growth can accumulate and it can hold that heat longer and have more fuel right there at that growing point area of the crown. And that's what happened with that little blue stem in that 4-county fire. And we saw a reduction of little blue stem. But the good news is that over time, we saw an increase of more desirable rhizomatous species like big blue stem and Cytotes grama that replaced that little blue stem. The little blue stem didn't completely disappear, but it was reduced significantly, and we got other grasses that replaced it.
So when we think about the wildfire for that little blue stem versus maybe a prescribed burn, does a prescribed burn not usually take care of that?
In prescribed burn, like what Molly mentioned earlier, we're usually doing prescribed burns under conditions that are more controllable, and they tend to be less intense fires. So like wind speeds are usually like 5 to 15 miles an hour from one direction, and humidities are usually like 40 to 70% in those prescribed burns. So the vegetation has a certain amount of moisture in it, and so heating up that moisture in that fuel takes some of the intensity of it out. And so these wildfires, they occur under high wind speeds, like 30 to even up to 100 miles an hour in the case of that Fort County fire, and humidities that are low, like 10 to 20%. And so there's very little moisture in the fuel. And so all the heat, it's really generating a lot of heat and a lot of intensity, and really is much less predictable and harder to control. And so that's one of the reasons why these wildfires can be more intense, is because those conditions that Molly talked about earlier of being a planned and unplanned fire, and the environmental situation around both of them.
Like what Keith's talking about, like 10% humidity and winds 30, 40 or more, we would not do prescribed fires under those conditions because of the control aspect.
Have you seen impacts for other types of forages as well?
Well, some of the impacts that we see from any fire across the landscape is we can control some invading species, and especially down in some of those southern counties. And as we get further west in the state, we're seeing more and more encroachment of eastern red cedar. And so just any fire on the landscape is good at helping to try to reduce red cedar on pasture and to limit its encroachment. Of course, prescribed burns are much better for doing that, but we can see some control of eastern red cedar even in these unplanned wildfires. So even though they're unplanned, they can be damaging to human placed things out on the landscape, like fences, buildings, man-made structures that, it's really unfortunate that, wildfires will damage those and ruin those, but it also has the positive effect that we can get some reduction of some of these encroaching things like eastern red cedar trees out on the landscape.
What about the impact it has to soil?
Yeah, so sometimes when we think about soil, folks will hear about, say, like wildfires further west, and issues like with hydrophobic soils can make soils hydrophobic as they get superheated. And this creates concerns with erosion, like you have runoff and things like that. But we wouldn't expect that to be the case in our system. But for the most part, what we're immediately concerned about when it comes to soil is erosion. And so especially in the counties that were affected in the southwest part of the state, there's a variety of soils, but one of the things we're really concerned about is really sandy soils, which are pretty common. They're really susceptible to wind erosion. And when we don't have, even though we expect those plants to recover and they are fire adapted, when we don't have as much vegetative cover, if any, after a fire, those soils are a lot more vulnerable to erosion, especially when we have high wind events in the spring.
Yeah, that's the most, I guess, important factor as far as a soil aspect is concerned, is the loss of vegetative cover and litter cover, because that vegetative cover and litter cover is what will capture moisture when it falls in the form of snow or rainfall. And then if you don't have that cover there, you get the runoff, like what Molly talked about. But also once it gets in the soil, if it does get in the soil, if it does infiltrate, the loss of that vegetative cover also allows the soil to dry out more quickly. And so even if there is no erosion that takes place, just that loss of cover will allow that soil to dry out more rapidly because it doesn't have that litter cover or vegetative cover there to stop evaporation from happening. That soil is going to warm up more quickly and it's going to dry out more quickly. So one of the things that we really look for is having an immediate vegetative cover on these areas. That's one of the best things that we could hope for when wildfires has occurred, is that there's enough moisture in the soil and it's at a time when plants are getting ready to grow, close to the growing season, to the start of the growing season, so that we get that vegetation growing and covering the soil as soon as possible. That way it stops the impact of rainfall hitting the soil surface, stops the flow of water off the landscape and helps it to infiltrate, and we get that water going back into the soil for those plants to use. So the closer to the growing season we are, usually the less impact a wildfire will have on overall production of that pasture unit.
Molly, you made a mention of stocking rates, and what might cattle producers need to consider when they're thinking about putting their cattle back on this ground?
It is hard to say initially, because we also don't know how much precipitation we're going to get in the coming months, which is really important for how much production we'll expect to get over the season. But a good first step, I'd say, is to expect maybe a 50% reduction of stocking rate if we're talking in the southwest part of the state. But I'd say in the first year, maybe if you're talking about a burned area, to assume maybe a 50% reduction in stocking rate to start. And to make sure to monitor how much production you're getting and how much precipitation we're actually getting, especially in April, May, and June. And be as adaptable as you can to reduce your stocking rate if necessary. And it can be a little bit more complicated too if you have a matrix of burned and unburned areas. Some folks might have that, and you might want to consider depending on where your water sources are, right? So cattle will naturally go to burned areas, especially if they're getting some nice green growth. That forage that's coming up is really nutritious and tasty. So they'll tend to hang out in that area, but it also means that can make that area vulnerable to getting overused after a wildfire. So if you have a matrix of burned and unburned areas, you can adjust your stocking rate depending on what the composition of burned versus unburned is.
That was K-State's Molly Reichenborn and Keith Harmoney. We're cutting to a short break, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by those two as we continue the conversation and Molly comments on the different options. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with the continued conversation on rangeland and pasture management after wildfires. And continuing on the topic, we have K-State Extension Rangeland Management Specialist Molly Reichenborn and K-State Range Scientist at Hays Keith Harmoney. Molly, you ended the last segment discussing about putting cattle back on these pastures, and while we're thinking about that, what are a few different options for managing those pastures after a wildfire?
You could, in theory, stock your unburned area pretty close to what you would normally, and then reduce the stocking rate on the burned area. But you also want to consider where your water sources are. So if you're restricted in some way to only, they have to go through a burned area, to consider that too, and how you might want to arrange fencing.
Well, I'd say that the conditions before and after every wildfire is kind of unique, especially as far as the weather parameters, and management and how those interact together. So, putting an exact amount on what you might expect for production loss is it's going to be unique to any pasture, but at the 25 to 50% range is probably a pretty good general assessment of how much production you might expect to lose in that first year, depending on, like Molly said, how much early precipitation we receive for getting that vegetation up and growing and being able to capture any other moisture that would happen to fall. But in that very first year, that 20, especially for where that Ranger Road fire was located, a 25 to 50% reduction is probably a reasonable expectation. So monitoring over time is going to be important to make sure that you're not overstocked on those pastures. I will say that in monitoring the 4-county fire and the vegetation and production that we had following it up in the north central part of the state, we saw about a 25% reduction in production that very first year. And in the second year of production, that second growing season, we saw no reduction in production at all, because the little blue stem that we lost was replaced by the big blue stem and side oats grama, and the production from it made up for any losses on those areas. We actually had more production loss from the drought that occurred that very first growing season in 2022 after the fire than we did from the fire itself. We had about a 40% production loss in unburned areas just because of the drought. And the production loss that we had from comparing burned and unburned areas was a 25% difference. So we had more production loss from the drought conditions than we did from the fire itself in that very first growing season after the Four County fire.
So as we're talking about burned and unburned areas, if per se someone's field is just partially burned, do you want to burn it and put it on the same playing field, or what's the best management strategy?
So you can, but depends on where you're at, right? So different parts of the state, folks are more likely to use prescribed fire or want to use it as a management tool. Out further west, we burn less often, and there's the history of how often fires return to the area is much lower than than in the eastern part of the state. So if we were to have wildfires like in the eastern part of the state, especially like when the Ranger Road fire occurred, so the other fires might be like, okay, well, I'm just going to burn the rest of my field, when I plan to do it anyway. And then you might manage it relatively similarly than you would any other year. But if you are in the western part of the state where fires are less frequent, and you may not use prescribed fire regularly for a management tool, then you might want to say, like, if you don't want to put fire on the ground, then you might want to manage those two. Like if you have two parcels, say, that are burned or unburned, you might want to manage them differently. Like say you could stock pretty similarly as you would any other year in the unburned area, but reduce the stocking rate in the burned area. So if you are, say, you could also leverage it to do like a patch burn grazing scenario, in which case, basically what folks do is they divide up their property and burn one patch of that every 3 years. And this basically encourages cattle to use the recently burned area because, again, the forage there has a high nutritive quality and they tend to aggregate there anyway. And so it just naturally gives rest to other parts of the property. So that's something that you can do. I suspect most of the folks in that area probably is not something that's in their plans. So they probably are more likely to just manage those areas separately, if that makes sense.
And Molly, you were recently out in Western Kansas, and so wanting to just see from your perspective, how are producers feeling after this unfortunate event?
So I met a few folks. We had an event in Ashland actually last week. There was a few folks there, some producers who said that they had some green up already. And again, this is not to minimize the loss that's happened in that area. Structures, among other things, people lost forage and hay, animals, all of that. So it's not to minimize any of that. But the upside was that the soil conditions were starting to dry out, but we still had okay soil moisture just south of Ashland. So it looks like we're getting some green up already, which is great. The caveat to that is that in the coming months, we're still expecting, and this has been seen in the drought conditions map that's come out like this week and the week before, we're starting to see increasing drought and loss of soil moisture. And again, if we don't have a lot of vegetation on the surface, we can expect that we'll lose more moisture to evaporation. So I'd say some regrowth and cautiously optimistic. It could be worse. But to temper that a little with that, we expect that there'll still be conditions favorable to drying in the coming weeks and couple of months. So
anything else when it comes to rangeland and pasture management after wildfires?
I'd say just for the general public that it's important for folks to know what we first talked about, that there is a big difference between a prescribed burn and a wildfire burn, and just know that when producers are putting fire on the landscape for prescribed burns, that they're doing it under conditions that are more controllable and actually safe for themselves and for the general public versus a wildfire that comes through. And so hopefully folks don't associate prescribed burning with wildfires, because they are two very distinct and separate things. And one is a great tool for us to use, and the other one is an unfortunate occurrence, but in the long term, there are some positive things that can come from wildfires as well.
Keith, Molly, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
All right. Thank you very much, Shelby.
Once again, that was Kansas State University range scientist at Hays, Keith Harmoney, and he was joined by K-State Extension Rangeland Management Specialist Molly Reichenborn as they discussed rangeland and pasture management after wildfire. If you are wanting to hear more of this conversation and missed the first segment, you can find it by going to agtoday.net or by searching for Agriculture Today on your favorite podcast platform. If you're wanting to read more on this subject, you can do that by checking out the e-update article in the February 26th issue, which is titled Rangeland and Pasture Management After Wildfire. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and USDA Office of Homeland Security Director Matt Allen as they discuss collaboration that have taken place among federal agencies as it's a part of USDA's efforts to boost national farm security through its recently announced action plan.
Farm security is national security. And from that context, USDA's National Farm Security Action Plan involves interagency partners on the federal, state, and local levels to protect our nation's ag sector.
Across the federal community, we have different perspectives, different interests, and different stakeholders. But we all share the belief that protecting U.S. agriculture protects the United States from its adversaries.
That's USDA Office of Homeland Security Director Matt Allen speaking at this year's Agricultural Outlook Forum. He notes Agriculture Department collaboration with agencies such as the Treasury and War Departments in protecting threats to all areas of ag, from farmland itself to biotech.
Agriculture is highly technical and sophisticated, perfectly measured and adapted to maximize productivity.
Hence the need through these partnerships to share information regarding security vulnerabilities in agriculture and develop novel technical solutions and innovations to farm-based challenges. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Once again, that was USDA's Rod Bain and USDA Office of Homeland Security Director Matt Allen as they discussed collaborations taking place among federal agencies as part of USDA's effort to boost national farm security through its recently announced action plan. I would like to remind you, you can always find our previous shows and today's show by going to agtoday.net or by searching for Agriculture Today on your favorite podcast platform. When we come back from our break, we'll be joined by K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan as he discusses planting vegetables this time of year.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Some gardeners across Kansas may have already started planting some cool season crops outdoors, like peas and lettuce. However, now is the typical time to start planting crops like broccoli, cabbage, and turnips. K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan discusses how to start planting cool season crops in the home garden. Matt, we finally reached that point where we're really starting to get serious about planting the vegetable garden, and most cool season crops can be planted outside by maybe the second or third week of March?
Yes, by the middle of March, most of our cool season crops are ready to start being planted outside. The Kansas weather is really going to vary from year to year, so March 15th isn't a perfect date. But for the most part, it's a great time to consider planting a lot of our cool season crops.
We're looking at soil temperature as one of the determining factors?
Yes, really soil temperature and moisture are going to be the two things that are really critical in getting some of these seeds that we might plant to grow. And as we warm up, this spring especially, it's been pretty warm soil temperature-wise across the state. And so a lot of these crops will be successful if we start to plant them now.
Your veteran gardeners know which ones to plant first, but for people like me, what are some things that we should be considering?
Yeah, cool season crops are going to be plants that grow best in the cool weather of the season, either in the spring or in the fall, when temperatures are still cool. And that's going to include a wide variety of vegetables, including things like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbages and kales, onions and potatoes, a lot of our root crops like carrots, radish, turnips, and even some unusual crops like Swiss chard would also be great to plant this time of year.
The Kansas Garden Guide has a really good section on the timing dates of some of these.
Yes, with a wide variety of plants that we can plant as cool season crops, We really want to look at a resource like the Kansas Garden Guide. There's also a kind of a smaller version of that called the Kansas Vegetable Garden Planting Guide, with great charts on when the ideal time to plant some of these crops are and what kind of marginal windows we might have either before or after those periods to establish some of these plants as well. When we talk about cool season crops, there are even ones that can be planted sooner. And so things like peas, lettuce, and leeks, for example, could all actually be planted a little bit earlier in March outdoors because they're a little bit more cold tolerant than even some of the other cool crops we've discussed.
I guess before we really even start doing the planting, we want to make sure that we have everything lined out. We know exactly where we want to plant this, that, and the other thing.
For sure. We will also want to make sure that our garden soils aren't too wet to be working or to be out there planting. So there's a lot of prep that we want to do before. We want to make sure that we've conducted a soil test maybe earlier in the season so that we know what kind of nutrients that we need to add at planting time or during the growing season. We want to make sure that we've maybe considered adding a little bit of organic matter into that soil as well, some compost or some ground up leaves that is going to help increase the health of our soil. And then, once we get things lined up, we're ready to actually start doing some of that planting.
If you're someone who can only do container gardening, this is probably really well suited for this.
It is. There's a lot of these great vegetable crops that can really yield themselves well to a container. I personally always grow lettuce in containers because it's easy to just put outside the door. So it makes harvesting really easy as well. And I don't necessarily have to walk to the back of the garden to be able to harvest some of these leafy greens that I might want to enjoy.
Are any of these cool season crops easier to grow than others? What's the success rate if you're kind of a new gardener?
Yeah, if you're a new gardener, there's definitely some that'll be easier to grow than others. I think lettuce is a really easy cool season crop that you should be able to grow. Onions is usually a pretty forgiving plant as well. With onions, though, I would typically start with a bulb rather than the seed, just because you're going to get a lot bigger onion before the heat of the summer sets in.
Probably don't have time to cover it today, but there's a lot of steps that go into the actual gardening process in terms of the planting, the harvesting. So those are things that people might keep in mind too.
For sure. And I think as much as anything, we want to make sure that we're starting with varieties that are really going to thrive in the Kansas weather that we have. And so there's a lot of great resources out there to help you pick varieties of all these vegetable crops that are really going to be well adapted to our climate. And so you can find that in the Kansas Garden Guide. You can also look for that in publications such as the Recommended Vegetable Varieties of Kansas.
That's K-State Extension horticulture expert Matt McKernan with information on how to plant cool season crops this spring. He also recommends subscribing to their horticulture newsletter, a weekly publication put out by extension specialists with timely information on top trends and research in horticulture, as well as any disease or pest issues appearing across the state. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.